Hello, I'm Brendan Mitchell. Welcome to the CAPSTE Conversation series. On this episode, I have Dr. Richard Churches. Dr. Richard is the lead advisor for education reform and evidence-based practice at the Education Development Trust. Welcome, Dr. Richard.
Thank you, Brendan. It's a great pleasure to be here talking to you today.
No, it's an honour to have you appear on the CAPSTE Conversation series, and we look forward to learning more about you and your experiences. But let's start with who are the Education Development Trust, or EDT?
Well, we're a global services company and we only work in education, but we're very different to most education companies because we're a charity, which means although we work commercially and we usually work for large governments, at the same time, any money we make, we reinvest in research. And I work for the research part of the company called Research and Consultancy.
Okay. And EDT is not only based working out of the UK, but it's a global organisation, isn't it, that makes a significant contribution to education development, yes?
Yes, we usually do very large global change programs. So in Rwanda, we're delivering the National Literacy and Numeracy program. In Brunei, we deliver literacy and numeracy there across the whole country. We have offices in India, across Africa. We also do some work in South America, for example, in Mexico. But we're not just theorists, we understand the job of teachers and we actually run schools. So we run an academy chain in England, which is a group of schools that have a lot more independence from government because they reach a certain standard. But we also have international schools. For example, the International School of Cape Town is one of our schools.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
You know, was that a recent thing, or was that prior to when EDT used to be known as CFBT?
Yes, well, we started 50 years ago, and 50 years ago we were called the Centre for British Teachers because we were a centre for British teachers. And then over time we began to expand into large government work, international work. We did a lot of work in England as CFBT. We ran and wrote the national strategies, which was for all 28,000 schools in England. We designed performance management for all schools in England, so we did a lot of the large change work for the Labour government. But we also worked for this government in England as well, which is Conservative Party, and for the Coalition. I work on a programme called Future Teaching Scholars, which is a new route into teaching, and I work
what's
in
that
education.
new route? Is that does that replace the PGCE, or?
So this one is a new route, as in it starts in the sixth form, and so this is targeting maths and physics students with exceptional predicted A-level grades. They go to a behavioural assessment centre that was designed by psychologists, and if they're successful and they get the A-levels, we then support them during 3 years of university life. Then we allow them to do qualified teacher status in partnership with an outstanding teaching school. And today you can do a PGCE, but you can also train using a route called SCIT, Qualified Teacher Status, which stands for School-Centred Initial Teacher Training, where you train on the job as a serving teacher with support from an outstanding school and practice, and we do that. So it's unique because it starts in the sixth form and it's a 6-year teacher training program. And I think all of that helps to explain why we're not just the Centre for British Teachers anymore. And about 4 years ago, Steve Mumby, who used to run the National College for School Leadership, which was then called the National College for Teaching and Leadership in England, he became our chief executive. And he said, the first thing I think we should change is the name, because we're not a Centre for British Teachers. We are much more global for that. And we do education work. And we do development work in developing countries, even some post-conflict reconstruction. We do a lot of work in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, in very challenging environments. And we are technically, legally, a trust. We have a board of trustees that manages essentially the business and makes decisions about the finances that we have, most of which are generated through our commercial activity. So education, development, trust, said better what we do as a company, and that's why the branding changed.
For sure. Now, let's go back to where it all began for you in your education journey. Your undergraduate degree was in music. What influenced this decision?
Actually, it's a very interesting story, and probably why I ended up in the job that I am. I went to a comprehensive school, which was a non-selective school, in the era in education in England where we didn't really have accountability and structures. And in all honesty, probably music was the only thing I could have got to university doing, because the quality of teaching and learning was not that great. And I started singing as a chorister in a church choir, and then singing was something I was good at, and then I moved into that really qualification-wise step by step. But that's probably what's driven me to make schools better, because I didn't go to one that was particularly good. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So I ended up at London University, which was great. I had a terrific time there, and I became a postgraduate student studying composition. And I've worked as a professional singer and a composer and conductor as well. And that was really my sort of journey. But I've always had a lot of other interests and done other qualifications, which I know you're probably going to talk about later.
I certainly am. But do you still sing?
Very occasionally. I mean, people now are going to be listening to my baritone voice. But in the last few years, with the latest books and the work I've been doing, the research work, I've not had much time to do that. But up until 4 or 5 years ago, I was still performing with a group called Vermilion.
Do you have any recordings that we could perhaps link to this interview?
There are some recordings of my music being performed, but of course we're in an era now, 30 years ago is a long time ago, and there wasn't YouTube, and if you wanted to make a recording, it was done by other folk. So I'm not sure you can link to anything on YouTube directly, but I can send you a link to something that was recorded by someone else anyway. So.
Okay, excellent. Now, what led you to the teaching position? And I understand your first teaching position was in Italy.
Yeah, it was. So my composition supervisor, who I studied composition with, was someone called Brian Dennis, and he was an expert in music education, and particularly in getting children to compose in the classroom, even if they couldn't formally perform a musical instrument. And so he had that interest. Now, although my studies weren't directly in that area, I was asked to a certain point through him, as I recall, to be part of a consultation group for the Department for Education and Employment, as it was called back then, because England were revising what was called the O-level examination, which people take age 15, 16, to turn it into the GCSE, General Certificate in Education, and they wanted to make sure that music included composing and performing. Previously, it had just been predominantly theoretical, and so they wanted to do that. So I was part of that composition process, and I did some workshops, some composition workshops as well in some schools. And one of those schools was an international school that sent my CV off, and I got a phone call from a head teacher in Italy who said, "Can you come and work in my school?" It was slightly more complicated, like longer process than that. We had to send an application form in. But essentially he said, "Look, I want you to come and work in my school." And I said, "Well, I'm not really a teacher, I'm a musician." He said, "Well, thank goodness for that." And I think that's been my philosophy in working as an education government advisor and consultant really for the last 15 years, is the answer is to get your children to do the subject, not to learn what other people have done in the subject. So if you're teaching music, the children should do music. If you're teaching geography, the children should be geographers, not learn what geographers used to do in the past. And that ultimately is what creates interesting and inspiring lessons, I think. So that's how it happened, and I sort of got a bug for it really. I was very lucky at the international school. I wasn't formally a qualified teacher at that point, and but it went really well, and I got some great mentorship from someone who'd done a B.Ed in the PE department, explained to me what I wasn't getting right all the time. And originally they were revising the music department, and there was a room next door that was the staff room that was open to my room. So people would come up afterwards and give me feedback all the time, which as a musician was perfectly natural because you learn through feedback constantly. So I was very surprised when I then came back to England and I qualified as a teacher and got qualified teacher status, but I was very surprised at the lack of feedback and observation people got. But that was the journey, and I was very lucky to end up as director of music at a haberdasher school in England, which is a very good school for music.
Similar role to what you had in Italy,
was
it?
Director of music, yes. That was the next role. And then I contacted in a London education authority that said, look, we want teachers to come here, and I was just interested in what was next, and a head teacher invited me to work in a very challenging inner city school that was at that point considered one of the worst schools in London.
Was this high school or primary?
It was a secondary school.
Secondary.
So that, for international listeners, would be children aged 11 until 16, and then we added in what we call a sixth form, which is sort of 17 to 18 eventually. And it had failed its inspections. It had failed in every possible way, and was quite a very challenging and difficult place. But the head teacher wanted the children to perform, and so he got a teacher from the Brit School to be the drama teacher. He got an artist to come in and do art, and he got me to come and we hit the kids with a lot of musicals. Basically, was part of the strategy, and that was great, really. And then I went on from there ultimately to do senior management roles with deputy headship, leadership responsibilities.
How did your career progress from the classroom into leadership and management roles?
Yeah, well, I think if you want to progress quickly from classroom to leadership roles, my top tip would be to go into a failing school, because actually often there are a lot of opportunities there. But the reason I got promoted quickly, I mean, if you can get the children to behave, and the way you do that, by the way, teachers listening, is to teach good lessons. If you teach good lessons and you're fair to the children, they like you, and if they like you, they behave for you. They don't like you because you're nice to them. They behave and they like you because you teach them things that keep them occupied, and they enjoy the fact that you know stuff. Then you will get it. So I had roles like deputy head of year type roles, those type of ones.
Did you engage in a fair amount of professional development, self-learning?
Yeah, I did. I've been right from the start, because I always felt a little bit, because I started teaching before I became a qualified teacher. I developed this obsession with the research evidence. So I'm sort of like this complete nerd for reading what research evidence says, and for correcting people when they talk about things that we know there's no evidence for. And so that's been a theme throughout my time. I started a master's degree, which I completed. I started it with Manchester Metropolitan University, and then because I moved schools, I finished it with the Open University. And that was a great thing to do, which included leadership. And I studied a lot of things around school leadership and judging, teaching and learning, and teaching teacher quality. So that was a big step. I trained to be an Ofsted inspector while I was still a teacher in school, which was a tremendous thing to do.
What's the training for an Ofsted inspector?
Well, I can talk about what it was like in the year 2000.
Yes.
It was a whole year, and it was probably the toughest thing I've ever done in my life. So you had to do a series of weeks of training, and then you had to pass an exam like an A-level exam. They even invigilated you to go to the toilet, and you weren't allowed to speak, and there were these challenging tasks to do.
Were you working at the same time during that? Or
yeah, so around about 2000, slightly different now, they wanted to put in place a process where have as many serving teachers as Ofsted inspectors as they could. And so I was in a senior management role at the time, and I applied to be an Ofsted inspector. And that meant that you left school to go and do some Ofsted inspections, so that you were a serving senior manager on an Ofsted inspector team. And that was the strategy then. That doesn't really, it still happens, but not to the same degree. So those things really informed where I am. And then the final part of the career was I met a head teacher in East London, because I was thinking of next step for me was to become a head teacher. I was absolutely determined that's what I was going to do. And I started the National Professional Qualification for Headship, which is the qualification then in England.
Is that run through a university or a teacher's professional body? Or
at that time it was run by the National College for School Leadership.
Okay.
Now it's still administered by the Department for Education as a licensed qualification, but administered by different providers today. It was compulsory then, but it's been made optional now. But it was a compulsory thing, and I did that. But then in the middle of starting that, I met a head teacher who said, "Don't become a head yet. There's a new program in England called the Advanced Skills Teacher Program." And it sought to find, at that time, the top 1,000 teachers in England. And you could apply for the programme, and the head said, come here and do this. And there were all sorts of benefits. They would match your senior manager's salary. They give you a day a week to become a consultant. So I spent a day a week travelling around South London helping teachers who weren't succeeding in the classroom. And it was a really exciting post, but again, I had to have my own Ofsted inspection, and they had to interview parents, children and things, and I was appointed as one of the first 400 outstanding teachers in England and given one of these roles. And so that was the end of my teaching career, because I saw an advert advertised in the back of a newspaper in England called the Times Educational Supplement, and applied essentially for the job that I now have with Education Development Trust.
And we're going to come back in a minute as in the part 2 of this conversation to talk about your role at EDT and also more about your professional journey and some tips and advice for potential both educators and scholars.
Great.